The dust of the town square tasted of shame. It coated the back of her throat, a grit as fine as milled flour but carrying the bitterness of defeat. She stood on the raw lumber of the auction block, a girl no older than 10, barefoot and thin as a fence rail. Beside her, her brother, younger by a few years, did not tremble. He had gone past trembling into a state of stillness, like a stone at the bottom of a cold creek. Their hands were tied with a length of rough twine, not to restrain them, but to present them as a single miserable lot. They had a name once. Their mother's voice had shaped it for them, a soft sound in the dark of their lean-to shack. But that voice was gone, buried with the fever that took her. Their father's voice, rougher, had followed it into the silence of the earth a month later, claimed by a collapse in the silver mine. Now they were just the orphans, or the debt. They were what was left over when everything else of value had been seized. The auctioneer, a man with a waistcoat stained by tobacco juice, tried to work a shine onto the dull reality of the situation. 2 for the price of 1, he boomed, his voice too large for the small, pinched faces before him. Hardy stock, used to rough living. The boys got a strong back in the making, and the girl, she can learn to cook and mend. A dry cough came from the small crowd. A few men in dusty hats and worn-out coats shifted their weight. The women of the town stood farther back, arms crossed, their faces tight with a mixture of pity and severe judgment. No one wanted another mouth to feed, let alone 2. Especially not 2 mouths that carried the shadow of bad luck like a contagion. The children were monuments to failure, and no one wanted that kind of reminder on their own land. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer on the raw wood. The girl, whose name had been Lena, kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the platform. She focused on its jagged line, a miniature canyon in the splintered plank. If she could trace its path all the way to the edge, maybe she could disappear into it. Her brother, Finn, stared straight ahead, his gaze empty, fixed on nothing. He was a ship abandoned in a dead calm sea, his sails torn, his rudder gone. $5? The auctioneer wheedled, his confidence beginning to fray like old rope. $5 for a pair of hands? That's less than the price of a decent shovel. Silence answered him. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thicker than the dust. The townspeople looked away, at the sky, at their own boots, anywhere but at the 2 small figures on the block. The children had become invisible, their humanity erased by the weight of their poverty. The shame in the air was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone who stood by and did nothing. It was a shared and sour communion. Then, from the back of the sparse crowd, a movement. It was not a man who stepped forward, but a woman. She was not like the other women with their tight-lipped judgment. She stood alone, a figure carved from the hard land itself. Her face was weathered, mapped with the fine lines drawn by sun and wind and sorrow. Her clothes were practical, a man's worn shirt and canvas trousers tucked into scuffed boots. Her name was Alara, and most in the town knew little of her except that she kept to herself on a ranch out in the scrublands, a place haunted by the memory of a husband and child long since passed. She carried whole winters in her eyes. Alara did not speak. She simply watched the children, her expression unreadable. She took in the bare, dirty feet, the hollows beneath their eyes, the way the girl's shoulder blades stood out like the wings of a starved bird. She saw the boy's unnatural stillness, a defense so deep it had turned him to stone. She saw not a burden, not a debt, but 2 saplings in the path of a fire. The auctioneer, desperate for any interest, turned his attention to her. "Madam? A bid? Surely a woman of property can see the value here." Alara's gaze remained on the children. The crowd shifted, murmuring. The lone woman from the drylands. The widow. What use would she have for them? Her farm was barely a going concern, a place of subsistence, not surplus. The auctioneer's oily smile faltered. He was about to dismiss them, to send them to the workhouse, a place from which few children ever returned. He raised his gavel, a final punctuation to their short, sad story. "Last chance, folks. And in that final, hanging moment, Elara raised her hand. It was not a bold gesture, just a slight lift, her fingers uncurling from a loose fist. It was a quiet, deliberate motion, as if she were testing the weight of the air itself. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. The auctioneer blinked, his mouth a small O of astonishment. A bid. The lady bids. What does the lady bid? Elara's voice, when it came, was low and steady, the sound of stones rolling in a dry creek bed. I will settle the debt. She named the sum their father had owed the mining company, a figure that was far more than the $5 the auctioneer had begged for. It wasn't a bid. It was a declaration. It was the price of 2 lives, paid in full. She walked forward, her steps even and unhurried. The crowd parted for her as if she were a force of nature they did not understand. She counted out the worn coins and bills into the auctioneer's sweaty palm, her movements precise. She did not look at him. She did not look at the townspeople. Her focus was entirely on the children. Transaction complete, she stepped onto the platform. The wood groaned under her weight. She knelt not before them but beside them, so she was at their level. She pulled a small, sharp knife from a sheath on her belt. Finn flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. Lena's eyes widened, the first flicker of life in them since she'd been forced onto the block. Elara did not reach for them. She simply held the knife up, showing them the blade, then slowly, carefully, moved it to the twine that bound their wrists. With a single, clean slice, the rope fell away. They were free, but they did not move. They were like birds that had been caged so long they had forgotten how to fly. She rose, sheathed the knife, and turned her back to them. Come, she said. It was not a command, but a simple statement of fact. Then she walked away from the block, away from the staring eyes of the town, toward an old, battered wagon waiting at the edge of the square. She did not look back to see if they were following. She trusted the space she had created behind her, a vacuum of safety that was more powerful than any rope. For a long moment the children remained. Then, slowly, as if waking from a long and terrible dream, Lena slid off the edge of the platform. Her bare feet met the dusty ground. She looked at her brother, a silent question in her eyes. He blinked, the stone cracking just a little, and slid down to join her. Together, they turned and began to follow the lone woman, 2 small shadows trailing in the wake of her quiet strength. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts. The journey to Elara's ranch was a long ribbon of silence stretched under a pale, unforgiving sky. The wagon wheels ground against rock and sand, a constant, rhythmic complaint. Elara sat tall on the driver's bench, her hands loose on the reins, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The children huddled in the back of the wagon bed, nestled between sacks of flour and a coil of new rope, not touching, 2 separate islands of misery. The landscape grew harsher the farther they traveled from town. The sparse grass gave way to scrub brush and sentinel-like cacti that threw long, skeletal shadows in the afternoon light. The wind picked up, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the loneliness of the land itself. Lena watched the woman's back. It was a straight, unyielding line, a bulwark against the vast emptiness around them. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and blood orange. Elara pulled the wagon to a halt beside a lone, gnarled mesquite tree. She climbed down without a word and unhitched the horses, leading them to a small patch of dry grass. From a crate in the wagon, she pulled a dusty canteen and a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She walked to the back of the wagon and held the canteen out to Lena. The girl stared at it, her eyes wide with mistrust. Kindness had always come with a price, a hidden hook. Elara's expression did not change. She simply held the canteen steady, her arm outstretched. The silence between them was not empty, but waiting. Finally, Lena's small, chapped hand reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed against Elara's, and the woman's skin was warm and rough, like sun-baked earth. Lena drank, the water cool and clean, washing the dust from her throat. She passed it to Finn, who drank just as thirstily. Elara then unwrapped the bundle. Inside were 2 pieces of dry bread and a hunk of hard cheese. She broke them in half and offered a share to each child. They ate quickly, without looking up, their hunger a raw, desperate thing. Alara watched them, her gaze softening for just a moment before the mask of stoicism settled back into place. She did not eat. They arrived at the ranch as dusk was bleeding into night. It was less a ranch and more a testament to sheer endurance. A small, sturdy house made of weathered wood stood against the encroaching dark, its windows like vacant eyes. A windmill turned slowly, its blades creaking a weary rhythm. A barn, a corral, and a few fenced-in fields completed the small homestead, an island of human effort in a vast, indifferent ocean of land. On a low hill overlooking the house, a single wooden cross stood stark against the fading light. Alara led the horses to the barn, and the children followed, unsure of what else to do. They watched as she unharnessed the animals, her movements economical and sure. She worked with a quiet competence that was its own language. Inside, the house was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and dark. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room. Everything was functional, worn smooth by use. There were no decorations, no frills, nothing to suggest a life beyond simple survival. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dust, and something else, a faint, lingering echo of absence. Alara gestured to a small room off the main one. Inside was a simple cot with a neatly folded blanket and a thin mattress stuffed with straw. It was more than they had ever had. "This is yours," she said, her voice filling the quiet space. She left them and returned a moment later with a bucket of water from the well and 2 clean, threadbare rags. She placed them on the floor just outside their door, an unspoken offering. Then she moved to the fireplace and began to build a fire, her back to them. The children stood in the doorway of their new room, watching the flames catch and lick at the dry wood. The fire pushed back the shadows, filling the house with a flickering, golden light and a welcome warmth. Alara cooked a simple stew of potatoes and salted meat in a pot over the fire. The smell filled the small house, a smell of home, a smell that felt like a promise. They ate at the table, the 3 of them, in a silence that was different from the silence of the journey. This was a softer silence, cushioned by the crackle of the fire and the warmth of the food. When they were finished, Alara took their bowls. She looked at them, her gaze direct. "No one will lock you in," she said. "The door has no lock," she pointed to their room. It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of a solemn vow. It was the first rule of their new life, an unspoken contract of safety. She was not their master. She was their sanctuary. That night, for the first time in months, Lena and Finn slept without the gnawing fear of what the morning would bring. They slept in a real bed, in a real room with a locked door that had no lock. And outside their room, Alara sat in a chair by the dying fire, keeping watch, a silent guardian against the vast, dark wilderness of the world. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Alara rose before dawn, her movements quiet and purposeful. She would milk the single cow, feed the chickens, and work the parched earth of her garden. She moved with a tireless energy, as if work were the only prayer she knew. At first, the children just watched. They were wary creatures, taming themselves slowly to the shape of this new life. They sat on the porch steps, small and still, observing the woman who had claimed them. They watched her mend a broken fence post, her hands sure and strong as she wrapped the wire. They watched her split firewood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful arc. She never demanded they help. She never even seemed to notice them watching. She simply existed, and in her existence, she created a space for them to exist too. It was Finn who broke the spell first. One morning, as Alara was carrying 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, he slipped off the porch. He scurried over to the woodpile, his small arms wrapping around a few pieces of kindling. He carried them to the house and set them carefully by the cold fireplace. He did it without looking at her, then retreated back to the safety of the porch. Alara said nothing, But that evening, when she served the stew, she placed an extra piece of salted meat in his bowl. A few days later, Lena began to sweep. She found an old, worn broom by the back door and started with the porch, her small, repetitive motions whispering against the wood. Soon, she was sweeping the floor of the main room, her work creating neat little piles of dust and grit. It was a small act, but it was an act of claiming. She was not just a guest in this house. She was helping to tend it. The house, which had been clean but sterile, began to feel lived in. It began to breathe again. One afternoon, while Alara was out mending a fence on the far side of the property, Lena found herself drawn to the low hill overlooking the house. She walked slowly, her bare feet pressing into the dry grass. She stood before the single wooden cross. There were no words carved into it, just the slow erosion of time and weather. A quiet, forgotten grief. From the pocket of her patched dress, Lena pulled a single, hardy wildflower she had found growing near the well. It was a tough little thing, a survivor, its petals a defiant splash of purple against the muted earth tones of the landscape. She knelt and gently pushed its stem into the hard-packed dirt at the base of the cross, a small offering to the silence. When Alara returned at sunset, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, she saw the flower. Her steps faltered for a fraction of a second. She stopped and looked at it, her gaze lingering on the splash of color. She did not look at Lena, who watched from the porch, her heart beating a frantic rhythm in her chest. Alara simply went about her evening chores. But later that night, as she sat by the fire, Lena heard her humming. It was not a tune, just a low, wordless sound, like the wind moving through dry leaves. It was the sound of a long frozen river beginning to thaw. The small gestures became the new language of the homestead. Alara left 2 pairs of mended boots by the children's door, small but sturdy, patched with her own steady hands. Finn took to feeding the chickens every morning, his initial fear replaced by a quiet pride as they fluttered around his feet. Lena began helping in the garden, her small fingers carefully pulling weeds from around the struggling bean plants. They worked in parallel, rarely speaking, but always aware of each other. They were 3 solitary planets who had slowly, cautiously, been drawn into the same orbit. Their shared silence was not empty. It was filled with the sounds of their shared life. The chop of the axe, the creak of the well pump, the sweep of the broom, the quiet bubbling of the stew pot. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a tapestry of routine and unspoken care. One night, a storm rolled in, a violent tantrum of thunder and lightning that shook the small house. Lena woke with a sharp cry, the crash of thunder dragging her back into the terror of the past. She was back in the dark shack, the fever raging, her mother's breathing shallow and ragged. She curled into a tight ball on her cot, whimpering, her small body shaking. Finn, woken by her cries, crept to her side and put a hand on her shoulder. But the fear was too deep. "Don't," she whispered, her voice choked. "Don't lock me in." Alara heard the cry. She rose from her chair by the fire and went to their door, which stood slightly ajar. She could see Lena's trembling form in the dim light. She heard the girls' panicked whispers. She did not enter the room. She did not want to frighten them further. Instead, she simply sat down on the floor outside their door, her back against the wall, a silent, solid presence against the storm. She sat there for hours, listening to the rain lash against the roof and the thunder roll across the plains, until the whimpering inside the room quieted and the rhythm of the children's breathing deepened into sleep. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was cool and crisp, and the earth smelled of rain. Finn came out of their room and saw Alara asleep in the chair, a blanket pulled around her shoulders. She had not gone to bed. Later that day, as they were shelling beans on the porch, Finn finally broke the long silence with a direct question. His voice was thin, but it carried across the quiet air. "Why?" Alara did not pretend to misunderstand. She stopped her work, her hands still in the bowl of beans. She looked out at the vast, open land, at the horizon that stretched on forever. Her face was a mask of old sorrows and hard-won peace. Because no child should have to stand on a block, she said, her voice quiet but firm. She looked at Finn, then at Lena, her gaze holding them both. Because the world is hard enough without people making it harder. And because, she hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the lone cross on the hill. Because my own girl would have been your age, Lena. And she loved wildflowers. It was the most she had ever shared. A piece of her own broken heart, offered up as a bridge. In that moment, the unspoken contract between them was sealed not with ink or promises, but with shared vulnerability. The foundation of trust, laid stone by silent stone, had finally set. The quiet ranch in the scrublands was no longer just a sanctuary. It was becoming a home. The peace was a fragile, hand-blown thing, and it was shattered by the appearance of a rider on the horizon. He was a black speck against the endless blue of the sky, growing steadily larger, a storm cloud rolling in on their quiet world. Alara saw him first. She was fixing the latch on the corral gate, and she froze, her hand still on the hammer. A stillness came over her, the same kind of wary alertness a doe has when it scents a wolf on the wind. Finn and Lena, playing a quiet game with stones near the porch, saw the change in her and fell silent. They followed her gaze to the approaching figure. Fear, a cold and familiar snake, uncoiled in their bellies. The past had a long reach. Alara said nothing. She finished hammering the nail into the latch with 2 sharp, decisive blows. She wiped her hands on her trousers and walked toward the house, her steps measured. "Go inside," she said to the children, her voice low and calm, betraying none of the tension that coiled in her shoulders. "Stay in your room. Do not come out." They obeyed without question, scurrying into the house like mice seeking shelter. They huddled together in their small room, the door closed but not locked, listening to the sounds from outside. The rhythmic beat of hooves growing closer, the jingle of a bridle, and then silence. The rider was Silas, the man who had held their parents' debt. He was a man whose cruelty was small and petty, which made it all the more vicious. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He had a look of smug ownership on his face, as if the very land he stood on already belonged to him. "Well now," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality as Alara stepped onto the porch to meet him. "This is a cozy little setup. I can see why you'd want to hide away out here." Alara did not answer. She stood on the top step, her body placing her just above him, a small but significant advantage. Her face was impassive, a stone cliff against which his words washed and broke. "I've come for my property," Silas said, his tone hardening. "There was an irregularity with that auction. The town council agrees. The debt wasn't settled proper. Those children are mine. Payment for what their father owed me." He used the word property, as if it were a brand, searing it into the air between them. He was not just claiming them. He was erasing them, turning them back into objects, into the miserable lot on the auction block. "They are not property," Alara said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but it carried an unshakable finality. "They are children, and they are home." Silas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Home? With you? A dried-up widow on a failing scrap of land? I'm their legal guardian now. I have the paperwork. I can offer them a life of purpose. They'll work for their keep. It's more than you can give them." "The purpose you offer is servitude," Alara replied, her gaze unwavering. "The keep you offer is a cage. They stay here." The confrontation had escalated, the air crackling with unspoken violence. This was not a negotiation. It was a battle of wills, fought on the porch of the small, weathered house that had become their fortress. Inside, Finn and Lena listened, their hearts pounding against their ribs. They heard Silas's cruel words, his claim of ownership. They heard Alara's quiet, steadfast refusal. Finn's hands clenched into fists. He looked at his sister, who was pale and trembling, her eyes wide with the remembered terror of the auction block. Silas took a step toward the porch, his hand reaching for the railing. "I'm not asking, old woman. I'm telling you,
stand Aside.
In that moment, something shifted in Alara. The quiet stoicism that had been her shield for years fell away, revealing the bedrock of fierce, protective anger beneath. She did not move back. She moved forward. She stepped down from the porch to stand on the same ground as him, her eyes level with his. She was shorter than him, but she seemed to take up all the space in the world. "You will not set foot in this house," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You will not lay a hand on them. You will get back on your horse and you will ride away. And if you ever show your face on this land again, you will find that a dried-up widow has very little left to lose and even less to fear." From the side of the porch, where she had left it that morning, she picked up a heavy wood axe. She did not raise it. She did not brandish it as a weapon. She simply held it, her knuckles white around the smooth, worn handle. It felt like an extension of her own arm, a part of her will made solid and real. Silas hesitated, his bravado faltering in the face of her cold, unyielding fury. He was a man who preyed on the weak, on those who were already beaten. He did not know what to do with a woman who refused to be afraid of him. Just then, the door to the house creaked open. Finn stood in the doorway, his small face set in a mask of defiance. In his hand he held a rock, heavy and jagged. He walked out onto the porch and stood beside Alara, a small, fierce soldier ready to defend his queen. Silas sneered. "What's this? You've got the boy playing protector now." He took a step toward the house, his hand outstretched, intending to grab Lena, who cowered just inside the door. "Come here, girl." And then, something broke in Lena. The fear that had held her silent for so long finally cracked, and what poured out was not terror, but rage. She stepped out from behind the door, her chin lifted high. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper of a frightened child, but the clear, ringing cry of a survivor.
"No."
The word struck Silas like a physical blow. He froze, his hand hovering in the air. He stared at the girl, at the boy with the rock, at the woman with the axe. He saw not three broken individuals, but a single, unified front. A family, forged in silence and sorrow, now bound by defiance. They were a wall he could not breach. He was a bully and a coward. He saw there was no easy victory here, only trouble and pain. The prophet he had imagined had evaporated in the heat of their collective will. He spat on the ground, a final, pathetic gesture of contempt. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "They're nothing but bad luck." He turned, swung himself onto his horse, and spurred it into a gallop, kicking up a cloud of dust that obscured his retreat. He did not look back. The three of them stood there, watching until he was once again a tiny speck on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the land. The threat was gone. Slowly, Alara lowered the axe, its weight suddenly immense. She leaned it against the porch. The tension drained out of her, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. Finn dropped the rock, its thud loud in the sudden silence. Lena let out a long, shuddering breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Alara turned and looked at them. She looked at Finn, standing so straight and brave. She looked at Lena, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears and a fierce, newfound strength. A smile touched Alara's lips, a rare and beautiful thing, like a flower blooming in the desert. She reached out and laid a hand on Finn's shoulder, then gently touched Lena's cheek. It was the first time she had initiated such a touch. It was an affirmation, a promise, a declaration. That night, no one spoke of what had happened. There was no need. The shared danger, the unified defense, had said everything that needed to be said. They sat by the fire, eating their stew, the silence comfortable and deep. The house felt different. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a stronghold. It was theirs. And for the first time, all three of them truly believed it. The night after Silas's departure was thick with a new kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting is done. A silence filled with the echo of what had been risked and what had been won. They sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air in the small cabin felt different, warmer, as if the house itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. Alara looked at the two children, who sat on the hearth rug, their faces illuminated by the firelight. They were no longer the ghostly, hollowed-out creatures she had taken from the auction block. The boy's stillness was now a thoughtful calm, not a stony defense. The girl's eyes, once downcast, now met hers with a shy but steady light. They had stood their ground. They had not run. In the flickering light, Alara finally did what she had been putting off for weeks. She rose and went to a small, locked chest in the corner of the room. It was the only locked thing in the house. She opened it with a small iron key she wore on a leather cord around her neck. The contents were few. A faded photograph of a smiling man, a baby's first leather shoe, and a small leather-bound book. She took out the book and returned to the fire. She held it in her lap for a long moment, her thumb tracing the worn cover. "My husband," she said, her voice soft. "He built this house with his own 2 hands. We thought we would fill it with children." Her gaze drifted to the flames. "We had one, a daughter. She was quick and bright, and she loved the color purple. She would chase butterflies for hours." She paused, the old grief a physical presence in the room. Lena and Finn watched her, their expressions full of a solemn, childish wisdom. "Her name was also Lena," Alara said, her eyes finding the girl's. "The fever took her when she was 6. Took my husband a year later. Not the fever, but the quiet. It ate him from the inside out." She looked at Lena, a deep and profound emotion in her eyes. I think she would have liked you. She would have been proud of the voice you found today." She held out the small book. It was a book of names. "When you came here, you had no name that the world would speak. But you are not no one. You have a name. If you want it." Lena looked at the book, then back at Alara's face. She didn't need to see the name written on a page. She had already been given it in the sharing of a story, in the naming of a ghost. She nodded slowly, a single, deliberate motion. A tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She was not replacing the first Lena. She was honoring her, continuing a legacy of quiet strength. She was Lena now. It was hers. Alara then turned to Finn. "And you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You stood like a mountain. Your father would have been proud." She did not offer him a name from the book. He had his own. What she offered him was something else. "This is your home now, Finn. For as long as you want it." It was more than a promise of shelter. It was a declaration of belonging. It was the final, formal act of building a family. The next morning, they performed a ritual. Alara gathered the ragged, filthy clothes the children had arrived in, the garments of their old life. She carried them out to a clearing behind the barn. Together, the 3 of them built a small pyre. Alara struck a match and set the rags ablaze. They watched as the flames consumed the tattered cloth, turning the fabric of their past misery into smoke and ash. The fire burned hot and bright, a cleansing flame that changed everything. It was a baptism by fire, and when the last ember died down, something new was waiting in the ash. Family. In the weeks that followed, the final vestiges of winter gave way to a tentative spring. Green shoots pushed their way through the hard-packed earth. The air grew softer. The change was not just in the season, but in the small house on the prairie. Laughter, a sound that had been absent for years, began to echo off the walls, first from the children. Then, one day, a low, rusty chuckle from Alara herself, when Finn tripped over a chicken and ended up with a face full of feathers. She taught them the rhythms of the land, the names of the constellations, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. They taught her how to play again, how to see the world not as a place of loss and hardship, but as a place of small wonders. The intricate pattern of a spider's web, the taste of wild honey, the warmth of the sun on your face. They were healing each other, filling in the broken places with unspoken kindness and shared days. The house was no longer hollow. It breathed with life. Lena's humming was a constant, cheerful presence. Finn's questions filled the quiet spaces. Alara's silence became a comfortable, peaceful thing, the silence of contentment, not loneliness. The lone grave on the hill was no longer a monument to what was lost, but a quiet reminder of the love that had made this new life possible. It now always had a fresh wildflower at its base. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land, the three of them sat on the porch steps, leaning against each other. They weren't talking. They were just watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep violet. The windmill creaked its familiar, weary song. A coyote howled in the distance. The world was vast and wild, but here, on this small patch of land, they had carved out a place of safety and belonging. They were a strange and beautiful constellation, three stray stars that had found their way into the same corner of the sky, burning all the brighter for being together. This story, it isn't just about a rescue at an auction block. It's about how a home is not four walls and a roof, but the safe harbor you build in the heart of another person. It's about the quiet, daily acts of grace. A bowl of stew, a mended boot, a shared silence by a warm fire that can stitch a family together from the most frayed and broken threads. Alara didn't save those children with a grand gesture of heroism. She saved them with consistency. She saved them by showing up, day after day, and offering them a space where they could finally lay down the unbearable weight of their past and begin to remember who they were meant to be. And in saving them, she found she was also saving herself, rebuilding her own life from the ashes of her grief. So here's your naming. We are all, at some point, standing on a block, feeling nameless, feeling like we are nothing more than the sum of our misfortunes. We wait for someone to see past the dust and the rags, to recognize the flicker of life that still burns within us. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, a quiet soul with winters in their eyes and enough space in their heart will raise a hand, not to claim us, but to set us free. And if you are very brave, you might find that the person raising their hand is you. For in the wilderness of this world, the surest way to find your own home is to build one for someone else.